What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Code Peterson tutorial, a little Adobe Premiere Pro action. And this is a fun lens distortion transition that could be used for a video slideshow. And then you can utilize it as a template later on in case you don't want to have to start from scratch or recreate the wheel, so to speak. I have two images here in my projects panel, City 1 and City 2, and they're both the same size. I went ahead and I made sure of that by cropping them to make sure that they're both 1920 by 1080 pixels. But yours can be any size you want. Just make sure that all of them are the same size for this. I'll click my City 1 and drag it in here. Then I'll click and drag City 2. And the effect I'm going to use is not going to be put on the actual clips, but instead, if I right click down here in this panel and I go to New Item and I find Adjustment Layer, then it's going to open up this window, which will use the same width and height as my track, which is what I want. So I'll click OK. Then click and drag this so that it's over the border between these two clips. Now, if I click up here in my timeline and drag, you get your little marker on there that kind of shows you where you are in relation to that timeline. So what I'll do here is click there right in between those two objects, and then I'm going to select my adjustment layer. And by dragging this slider, I can kind of zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to use my arrow key, and I'm going to go 5 spaces to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you can do this a few different ways, but if you use your razor tool, if you're familiar with those tools, I'll clip that there. Then I'm going to go back to the middle. Then I'm going to arrow to the right 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll use that same razor tool. And then if I go to my selection tool and I delete both sides of that, I have this small little adjustment layer that's right here. Okay, now the layer I want to place in this is if I go here to my effects panel, and if it's not showing up in your workspace, you can get it back just by going up here to window and finding effects, and it'll bring it up for you. And then in here for the effects, I'm going to type in lens and search for it, and it'll show me lens distortion. That's the one I want. So if I click and drag that onto my adjustment layer, now this adjustment layer in the effects controls shows my lens distortion options. Okay, now to begin with, I'll use my little click and drag positioner up here, and I'll bring that all the way to the left, and where it says curvature for lens distortion, I'll click the stopwatch. It's going to put a keyframe there. Then I'll click and drag this halfway to where it's halfway up here, and it's right above the border between City 1 and City 2. And then I will go here to the curvature value, and I'll type in -50. Now your number may be higher or lower, just depending on the size of the pictures and how much you want that distortion to be in your effects. I typically just start with -50, and then we can drag this over to the right as far as it'll go, and then change that -50 to 0. And here is the start of our transition. If I play this, we get that cool lens distortion effect in there. Now, if you want it to be slower, you can always just have a larger adjustment layer and have these keyframes be further than 5 spaces apart. You know, that's kind of how you can adjust that. Or if you want it to be faster, then you can always bring them closer together. When you look through here, this works pretty well. Sometimes you're going to have pictures that have different color amounts between the two pictures. These are both pretty similar actually, but sometimes you might have a color that has a lot of saturation than a color that doesn't have a lot of saturation, or a color that has a lot of reds in it, then you might have a color that has a lot of blues in it, and it looks a little more drastic, like it doesn't quite fit together. So something that I like to do to kind of fix that is if I go down here to effects, there's 2 of them that you can search for. Just because I'm a creature of habit, I tend to search for fast color corrector. That's the one I use. You'll notice here it's in the obsolete folder. So like sometimes if you're using an Apple computer, like a MacBook or whatever, it might not show up in there. So another one that gives you, we just want something that's going to let us use our saturation effects and adjust them with keyframes. And so one that you can use is also ASC CDL. That'll give you options in there also. So either one is kind of up to you. But if I go and select one of these, and if I use fast color corrector, for example, I'll click and drag it here. And then it gives me those options down here at the very bottom. So I can move my little timeline here to the left. And then I want to find the saturation. And I'll click the stopwatch because I want it 100% saturated. Then I can go over here halfway through and I can change that saturation to 0, which is essentially making it a black and white and gray image. Then I'll click and drag this right again, and then I will change this back to 100. Now when I do this, it makes the coloring a lot less dramatic between the two objects, and it looks like it's kind of just distorting into the other. All right, now again, that's optional. You don't have to use that if you don't want to. If I zoom out a little bit here and I go back to my projects panel and I have this done, then all I have to do, if I have all these different pictures in here, I can just duplicate that by holding down the Alt or the Option key, and I click and drag. It'll make a copy of it. I can place that over here. So then it remembers all of the things that we applied to this first one, and it gives us that effect in there, and it's easy to replicate. So down the road, if I wanted to make a new slideshow, and I could always take out these other pictures and bring in new ones, and that's going to work just fine. Uh, Another few things you might try out with, and this isn't really something you would use to make that transition in between those two pictures right there at that border a little more subtle. I suppose you could use a Gaussian blur in here and go from 0 Gaussian blur to 100 to 0. But to me, when you do that, you lose quite a bit of that lens distort, and I don't really like how that looks. So going back here to the effects, one thing you can play around with is you would be using like your, oh, cross dissolve is one that you could use. So if I search for cross or if I search for dissolve, it'll show up in here. And I can click and drag this right here, and it'll be a little more subtle between those two pictures. You can also click on this cross dissolve, and one thing you would probably want to do is actually even just shrink it down so it's shorter than the lens distort. So you can see that one's considerably smaller than the one above it. Now if I push play, it's a little bit more subtle in there. If you don't like cross dissolve, then another one you could try out with this that sometimes looks cool, sometimes it makes it look worse, but it is morph cut. And if the images have some similar shapes in them, and I'm gonna shrink this one down also so that it's smaller so you can kind of see. When I click and drag in here, you can see it moves those pixels around and kind of looks like it's almost transforming into the other shape. So there it is. And again, you don't have to use those transitions if you don't want to. For those, that's kind of up to you with that, but gives you some things to play around with. Let me know what you think of this tutorial in the comments if you would, or if you have some suggestions that you use for a similar method that work even better. Share them out with everybody else on the community below. Sure appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time to watch, and I hope you all have a great day, and we'll catch you on another tutorial video.